The kitchen filled with an unsettling aroma as Adesewa watched the pot bubble uncontrollably, her hope simmering away with each second. Her anxiety peaked when a sudden, sharp knock on the door jolted her. It was Yousef's mother, arriving earlier than expected. Heart racing, Adesewa opened the door to find her future mother-in-law's stern gaze and a hint of skepticism in her eyes. With a deep breath, Adesewa led her into the kitchen, where the chaotic pot awaited, its contents now a bizarre, bubbling mess. Will this culinary disaster be the end of her hopes, or is there a chance she might turn the tide and prove herself? Find out as we dive into the heart of Adesewa's dramatic test and discover if she can rise to the occasion. Adesewa stood at the threshold of the kitchen, her heart pounding with a mix of excitement and anxiety. Yousef's mother, a woman known for her strict adherence to tradition and high expectations, had just handed her a bag of ingredients with a challenge. Adesewa had been told to prepare a pot of soup, a task that felt monumental to her given her lack of experience in the kitchen. The ingredients lay sprawled across the counter: peppers, onions, assorted spices, and chunks of meat. Adesewa glanced at them uncertainty, her mind racing. She had never cooked a meal from scratch before, let alone one that would be scrutinized by her prospective mother-in-law. Her fingers fumbled as she tried to make sense of the unfamiliar items. Why did she ask me to do this? Adesewa muttered to herself, trying to steady her trembling hands. The pressure of proving herself was intense, and she felt a wave of doubt wash over her. This has to be a test. What if I fail? Determined to make the best of it, Adesewa decided to follow her instincts. She threw the ingredients into the pot, whole peppers and unchopped onions included, and filled it with water. She placed the pot on the gas cooker and turned on the heat, hoping that somehow, it would all come together. As the pot began to bubble, Adesewa's nerves frayed further. She reached for her phone to call Yousef for help, but he wasn't answering. She looks confused, her anxiety building as she watches the pot's chaotic contents. The morning sunlight filtered through the kitchen window, casting soft, golden beams onto the countertops. Adesewa stood in the middle of this warm, inviting space, clutching the note Mrs. Remy had handed her. It felt as though the piece of paper was a physical weight pressing against her chest. The note was straightforward yet laden with significance. Dear Adesewa, I would like you to prepare a pot of our traditional egusi soup for today's lunch. This recipe has been a treasured part of our family heritage for generations. It is not just about cooking, it's about understanding and honoring our traditions. Best of luck. Mrs. Remy. As Adesewa reread the note, the reality of the task before her began to sink in. She had never cooked egusi soup before. Her culinary experiences had been limited to basic dishes and takeout. Today, however, was different. She was expected to prepare a meal that was not only a family favorite but also a representation of Yousef's heritage. The kitchen was a blend of modern convenience and traditional charm. The gleaming appliances and neatly organized cabinets contrasted sharply with the well-worn countertop that bore the marks of countless meals prepared over the years. The ingredients for the egusi soup were laid out before her, egusi seeds, assorted meats, fish, locust beans, ground crayfish, palm oil, and various spices. Each ingredient seemed unfamiliar and intimidating. With a deep breath, Adesewa set to work. The first step was to roast and grind the egusi seeds. She turned on the stove and poured the seeds into a dry pan, adjusting the heat carefully. As the seeds began to pop and release their nutty aroma, she stirred them continuously, hoping to prevent any from burning. Her movements were jerky and unsteady, a stark contrast to the precision and skill she knew were required for this task. The aroma, although promising, did little to alleviate her anxiety. She poured the roasted seeds into a grinder and began to turn the crank, but the seeds did not grind as finely as she had hoped. The mixture was coarse and uneven, and she struggled to achieve the smooth texture that the recipe required. Her frustration grew with every failed attempt to get the consistency just right. Next on her list was chopping the assorted meats. The knife, which seemed to have seen better days, was blunt and unwieldy. The cutting board wobbled on the counter, making each slice more difficult than the last. Her cuts were uneven, with chunks of meat ranging from too large to too small. The once confident Adesewa found herself second-guessing each move, her hands growing more shaky with every minute that passed. Despite her efforts, she found herself adding the meat to the pot without seasoning it properly. Her attempts to correct this oversight by adding spices felt rushed and haphazard. The kitchen was becoming increasingly chaotic, with spices scattered across the counter, water splashed everywhere, and the aroma from the pot growing more overwhelming by the second. The next step was to blend the egusi paste with the meat and other ingredients. Adesewa's lack of experience was evident as she struggled to combine the components. The paste was too thick, and her attempts to thin it out with water resulted in a watery, unappetizing mess. The texture was off, and the flavors seemed to be melding poorly. She tried to add more spices to salvage the dish, but nothing seemed to improve the taste. As Adesewa stirred the pot, she realized that the soup was beginning to burn at the bottom. Panic surged through her as she desperately tried to scrape the burnt bits away. The once promising dish was now a dismal blend of overcooked meat and scotch paste. Her heart pounded in her chest as she came to terms with the fact that there was no saving this meal. She tried to adjust the heat and stir the soup, hoping that somehow it would improve. Her efforts seemed to only make the situation worse. The kitchen, which had begun as a place of hope and anticipation, was now a symbol of her inadequacy. Tears of frustration and helplessness welled in her eyes as she fought to keep them at bay. The kitchen was now a battlefield of frustration and despair. Adesewa's face was flushed, and her hands trembled as she stirred the pot. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, each second amplifying her sense of urgency. Her initial optimism had dissipated, replaced by the daunting realization that she was in over her head. She tasted the soup, only to find it bitter and gritty. Her attempts to correct the flavor seemed futile. She added more salt, more spices, but nothing seemed to make a difference. The once promising dish was now a disaster, and Adesewa's heart sank as she tried to make the best of the situation. The kitchen counter was a mess, empty spice containers, spilled water, and dirty utensils were strewn about. Every attempt to clean up only seemed to make matters worse. Adesewa felt like she was fighting a losing battle. Her frustration mounted with each failed attempt to salvage the meal. She wiped her brow, only to find that her face was streaked with sweat and perhaps a few stray tears. Her attempts to adjust the recipe had only compounded her problems. She had forgotten to add some essential ingredients and had used others in excess. The soup was now a watery, flavorless concoction that bore little resemblance to the traditional egusi soup she had envisioned. Each step she took seemed to lead her further from her goal, and the kitchen, once a place of potential, now seemed like a space of total defeat. Adesewa was overwhelmed by the complexity of the task. Her mind raced as she tried to recall the recipe, but the steps she had followed seemed to blend together into a chaotic blur. The instructions that had seemed so simple on paper were now a labyrinth of errors and missteps. Her initial confidence had faded, replaced by a crushing sense of inadequacy. As she stirred the pot, she noticed that the soup was starting to stick to the bottom. The burnt aroma was unmistakable, and every scrape of the spoon seemed to bring more of the burnt residue to the surface. Panic set in as she realized that she was running out of time. Her efforts to salvage the dish were met with limited success, and the kitchen continued to be a testament to her struggles. The sound of the kitchen door opening made Adesewa's heart skip a beat. Mrs. Remy entered, her presence commanding immediate attention. Adesewa stood frozen, her face flushed with embarrassment as Mrs. Remy's sharp eyes scanned the chaotic scene before her. "What is this?" Mrs. Remy's voice was cold and disapproving as she peered into the pot. The smell that wafted up was a mix of burnt meat and overspiced ingredients, a far cry from the traditional egusi soup she had envisioned. Adesewa's throat went dry as she tried to find the right words. "I'm so sorry," she stammered, her voice trembling. "I tried to follow the recipe, but..." "Follow the recipe?" Mrs. Remy interrupted, her voice rising in frustration. "This is a disaster. How could you think this would be acceptable? This isn't just about cooking, it's about respecting our traditions and our family standards." Adesewa felt as though she had been slapped. Mrs. Remy's disappointment was palpable, and it cut deeper than any criticism she had ever received. The weight of her failure felt crushing, and she fought to keep her tears at bay. Every attempt to explain or justify her efforts seemed inadequate. "This is completely unacceptable," Mrs. Remy continued, shaking her head. "I had hoped for something better. This," she gestured toward the pot with disgust. "This is not what I had in mind at all." The harshness of Mrs. Remy's words was like a blow to Adesewa's already fragile confidence. She wanted to apologize again, to make things right, but the words caught in her throat. The kitchen, once a place of potential, now felt like a space of total defeat. Mrs. Remy turned on her heel and left the kitchen, her footsteps echoing in the hallway. Adesewa stood alone, the reality of her failure sinking in. The meal, which had started as a hopeful endeavor, had ended in a disaster. She glanced at the charred remnants in the pot, feeling a deep sense of regret and disappointment. The kitchen, now silent except for the occasional drip of water from the faucet, felt cold and unforgiving. Adesewa stared at the mess she had created, her heart heavy with the knowledge that she had fallen short of expectations. The challenge had not only tested her cooking skills but also her resilience and ability to handle pressure. The disaster left her with more than just a failed meal, it left her with a lesson in humility and the harsh reality of her limitations. The quiet hum of the car engine was a soothing backdrop as Yousef drove home, his thoughts drifting to the afternoon ahead. The office had been unusually hectic, but the prospect of a relaxing lunch with his family was a welcome escape. He looked forward to returning to the comforting ambience of home, where the scent of a traditional meal would signal a break from the daily grind. As he pulled into the driveway, he noticed an unusual quietness around the house. His anticipation grew as he walked towards the front door, his mind already savoring the thought of a warm, hearty meal. Yousef's spirits were high until he stepped into the kitchen, where a scene of culinary chaos met his eyes. The kitchen, usually a picture of organized efficiency, was now a disaster zone. The once pristine countertops were strewn with spilled spices, empty containers, and smeared stains. The pot on the gas cooker was filled with a thick, unappetizing sludge. The smell that permeated the air was far from the fragrant, savory aroma he had expected. Instead, it was a burnt, acrid odor that made his stomach churn. Yousef's heart sank as he took in the sights before him. His eyes fell on Adesewa, who stood beside the gas cooker with a look of helplessness and anxiety. Her shoulders were slumped, and her face was flushed with embarrassment. It was clear that she had been under immense pressure, and the result was nothing short of disastrous. His gaze shifted to Mrs. Remy, who was seated at the kitchen table, her face a mask of frustration and disappointment. Yousef's emotions wavered between concern for Adesewa and anger at the situation. He felt a pang of guilt for her distress, but there was also a deep sense of betrayal that something so significant had gone so awry. What happened here? Yousef's voice was a mixture of disbelief and hurt as he addressed Adesewa. His eyes were filled with an emotion that straddled the line between empathy and frustration. He had hoped for a meal that would showcase Adesewa's respect for his family's traditions, but instead, he was met with a culinary catastrophe. Adesewa's eyes welled up with tears as she tried to explain. "I'm so sorry, Yousef. I really tried to follow the recipe, but everything just went wrong. I didn't mean for this to happen." Yousef's frustration was evident in the tightness of his jaw and the way his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "Adesewa, I understand that cooking something like this can be difficult. But it's not just about the food. It's about the effort, the respect for tradition." His words were a sharp reminder of the significance of the meal and the high expectations that had accompanied it. The disappointment in Yousef's voice was palpable, and it cut deep. Adesewa's heart ached as she saw the hurt in his eyes, the weight of her failure pressing heavily upon her. The kitchen silence was interrupted by the sharp, authoritative voice of Mrs. Remy. She stood, her posture rigid and her expression stern. The tension in the room was almost tangible, a thick layer of discord that hung heavily over everyone present. "Yousef, I need to speak with you," Mrs. Remy said, her voice tinged with a mix of frustration and resolve. She gestured towards the dining room, where the conversation would have a more private setting. Yousef, his emotions a swirl of confusion and resentment, followed her reluctantly. As they settled into the dining room, the air between them was thick with unresolved conflict. Mrs. Remy's eyes were hard as she looked at Yousef, her disappointment evident. I had high hopes for Adesewa today. I wanted her to understand and honor our traditions. But instead, what we've got here is a complete disaster. Yousef's face flushed with anger as he listened to his mother's words. I understand you're disappointed, Mother, but Adesewa was under a lot of pressure. She's not familiar with these recipes and that's precisely the point. Mrs. Remy cut him off, her voice rising in exasperation. She should have been more prepared. This isn't just about cooking, it's about respecting our family's legacy. Adesewa failed to live up to those expectations. Yousef's frustration boiled over as he responded, so what are you saying? That she's not good enough? That her efforts don't matter?